Diastasis Recti. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you know it all too well. But if you are one of the 60% of postpartum or pregnant women, chances are pretty high that you've heard the term diastasis recti and maybe have some feelings about it. Particularly if you are an active woman who wants to stay strong during pregnancy and wants to recover quickly in the postpartum period and get back to training as quickly as possible. If that is you, I get you, I was you, and in today's episode, you are going to be getting a 4-step process to know how to safely rebuild your core strength postpartum and improve diastasis recti if that's your goal, and integrate a strong core into your training so you can get back to doing the lifting that you love without low back pain, stress on your system, and feeling strong again postpartum. So if that's you, grab a pen, grab a paper. We're going to get really tactical here and we're going to dive in.
Postpartum is hard. One second we feel like our bodies are miraculous, and the next we feel like we're a complete mess, out of touch with the strong, confident women we used to be. All while the fitness industry pressures us to bounce back as quickly as possible to a body that never looked like it was pregnant to begin with. That's why, whether we're 3 days postpartum or 3 years postpartum, we need the refreshing truth of gospel-focused fitness to give us energy for the physical challenges of motherhood, peace with our postpartum bodies, and kingdom-centered motivation to train for strength and stamina. So mama, whether you're sipping on cold coffee or folding 5-day-old laundry, I pray by listening every Monday, you become equipped, encouraged, and empowered for a strong motherhood, all for God's glory. This is the Strong After Birth podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Before we can share any type of plan or framework that I'm going to be giving you today to help you restore your core strength and improve diastasis recti, there are some perhaps myths or misconceptions we need to break down about what diastasis recti is, the impact it has on our body, and really just how common and normal it is. But let's break down each of these together. So what is diastasis recti? Well, diastasis recti, or what many people call the gap, is a separation of a part of connective tissue that runs from the very, very bottom part of your sternum, and it goes all the way down past your pelvic floor right into the bottom parts of your hip bones. Now, this part of connective tissue is called your linea alba, and it's exactly what gets stretched as our stomach and our uterus grows to support the growth of our baby. Now, how amazing is it that can we just give a nod to God here for creating our bodies with that type of connective tissue right there. It's not like we're having muscles getting stretched to that point, but it is a piece of connective tissue that can stretch and has the ability to stretch, almost like it was designed for babies, right? So as our body goes throughout pregnancy, and the gap between the muscles of our core on either side of that, which would be our rectus abdominis, our external obliques, internal obliques, all the muscles around our core. Now, as those muscles stretch, they put more tension on the linea alba, and as a result, from either side, the linea alba can stretch from a horizontal perspective. Now, you would think, as the muscles get shorter postpartum, that connective tissue would shrink back as well. But the reality is that because of the length and duration of the stretch on the linea alba, it can take a lot more than just strengthening your core muscles to bridge the gap of diastasis recti. Now, before we even talk about how to bridge the gap and how to heal diastasis recti, I think it's really important to note that this is not just a muscle issue. You're talking about connective tissue here, which is another word for fascia. Now, fascia is not something that you can contract voluntarily. It is not like your bicep that you can tell to just flex. It doesn't have the same properties that skeletal muscle does, like having voluntary control, which means that there are other factors to consider, like rest and eating enough protein and getting enough water and getting enough collagen in your diet. And because of this, I think a lot of people can just focus on the exercise or just focus on bridging the gap, but forget the whole picture of their body and their lifestyle and how that can play a contribution into healing. And so in today's episode, yes, you are going to be getting a 4-step powerful process, but I want you to know that diastasis recti and healing and bridging that gap is a very holistic holistic approach. For anything in the body to heal, the body needs to be working towards health. And so while a lot of mom apps will give you all of these exercises, I want to press the brakes just a little bit and throw some questions at you right now. As you're listening to this episode, I want you to be asking which step that I shared today is going to be the most valuable for you. But if you've already done all of these steps, the chances are pretty high that there might be a missing piece. And I'm going to address some of those missing pieces at the end of the episode, so make sure you stay tuned for that, as well as when to know it's time to get help and call in the big guns from a pelvic floor PT. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, I think when it comes to diastasis recti and bridging that gap or trying to close down the linea alba postpartum, a lot of women think that if I don't do this, I'm going to have pelvic floor dysfunction. I'm going to have more back pain. I'm going to have incontinence. And yes, there are people who that is true for, but I want to demystify and perhaps just create some hope for you that you can be strong, you can be very, very healthy, you can be your strongest self and still have diastasis recti. There are many women out there who have a gap, maybe 10, 15, 20 years postpartum and have zero symptoms. So yes, while it is true there is a percentage of the population that can have low back pain with diastasis recti, they can have pelvic floor dysfunction with diastasis recti or have that mom pooch, I want you to know that that is not true for 100% of the population. In fact, more research is coming out to show that you can actually function very well with a small gap and have no symptoms at all. So I do want to also demystify perhaps the negative connotations that are associated with diastasis recti. I remember the first time at about 6 or 7 months in pregnancy, I was on the rower and I looked down at my core and I noticed it bulging for the first time. And I had this flood of, oh my gosh, it's happening to me. How could this be happening to me? I'm a trainer. And I just felt so scared and felt like I had to stop rowing immediately. And instead, Laura calmed herself down. She focused on her form and was able to do the exercise without bulging. But I think because of this fear, a lot of us can make the mistake of rushing into core exercises without taking the time to go through a process of assessing, isolating, and integrating into all of our training. Or they can spend so much time just doing core exercises. I was talking to a new client the other day and I asked her at, I think she was 10 months postpartum, what type of strength training she had started to integrate back in. And she said that she hadn't done any because she was still focused on healing her diastasis. And I think this is a big mistake because when we do that, we're missing out on the total body strength that our body needs postpartum. But like I said, I totally get it because there is so much pressure out there to heal your diastasis, bridge the gap, and it is a process that can take a lot of time to do, and everyone has a different healing timeline. But it does not have to be if you have diastasis, then you cannot exercise. That is not true, and believing that to be true can actually do more harm than good for your overall total stamina, endurance, and strength that's required and needed in motherhood. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about how we can build that core strength and how we can create confidence in our ability to train even with diastasis recti while working to improve it. Sounds good? Grab your pen, grab your paper, let's get in. Now, the first step of 4 is to assess your diastasis recti. Now, if you, like me, maybe did not even want to think about diastasis recti in the first couple of weeks postpartum, or the thought of seeing your scars in your vaginal canal or your C-section, if the thought of that just really made you uncomfortable, I just want you to know that I understand and I felt the same way. So I want you to do this when you're ready, but I would also really encourage you to identify what ready looks like for you and don't just push this off until someday, one day. Put a date on the calendar when you believe you'll be ready to assess your diastasis. Now, here's why it's so important to focus on assessing this. So when we assess our diastasis recti, and I actually have a 3-day core restore plan that teaches you exactly how to do this with guides and little checkboxes and video tutorials. So if you have not downloaded the 3-day core restore plan already, and you're listening to this podcast episode, what are you waiting for? This is going to be the best thing for your diastasis recti, you're going to head on over to truestrengthcollective.com/3-day core restore, or you can check the show notes for a direct link there too. That's fine. But you're going to want to go ahead and download that, because that is going to be like gasoline on the fire for you to help restore your core strength postpartum. Or even if you're not in that direct postpartum period of a year, this still applies to you. Subpoint here, I've trained clients in their 40s and 50s who have had a bulge with overhead pulling exercises or some types of crunches, and have helped them heal their diastasis recti even 20, 30 years postpartum. So if this is you and you're in that postpartum period, although once postpartum, always postpartum, right? If that's you, all hope is not lost. There is still hope. Your body is still capable of healing. It's still capable of getting stronger. So that's just a side tangent. But let's dive back into assessing your diastasis recti, because that's where we were. Now, the benefit of assessing our diastasis recti is it clears the air on what is. It demystifies what is going on with our core, and it gives us a very clear foundation to understand the status of our core. And by understanding the status of our core, we can know how to improve it. Now, I want to tell you guys that body shame has a very, very, very strong impact on how we see our core, right? And if we allow body shame and we skip this step, and we allow body shame to make us want to hide, the result of that is that we never know if we're making progress while we're doing core work and with our exercises. And if we never feel like we're making progress, how many of us want to keep going, right? That's why it's so important that we assess our pelvic floor. And if we skip this step, it can lead to slower recovery, even a greater separation if we're doing certain exercises like maybe crunches that can create more of a bulge. And with that extra separation can lead to a weaker pelvic floor, which can lead to urinary incontinence or fecal incontinence or urge control. None of these things are good, right? Which is no surprise that body shame has a result of negative consequences on our body, right? This makes sense. So that's why it's so important that we assess our pelvic floor and assess our diastasis recti gap postpartum. Now, if you're wondering how in the world do I assess my pelvic floor, how do I assess my diastasis recti, then I have a diastasis recti self-assessment in the 3-day core restore plan. There are videos, there's tutorials, so you're really going to want to check out that resource because it has an entire plan and checklist on how you can do it. Okay. Now, that's really important first step. Don't skip assessing your diastasis recti. There are 3 points to assess. You're going to be assessing above your belly button, about 4 inches above your belly button, at the belly button, and then 4 inches below your belly button. In the video, it's very simple, easy to follow, so you're going to want to assess first. Now, once we have assessed our diastasis recti, we are going to learn to isolate our pelvic floor and isolate a muscle called our transverse abdominis. Now, the transverse abdominis is a muscle that wraps around our trunk and cinches in our pelvic floor like a corset. Our transverse abdominis is the deepest muscle of our core that tends to get stretched out the most during pregnancy. And so that's why it's vital that we learned how to isolate our transverse abdominis. So that's why you'll really focus on breathing, and exactly why in the 3-day core restore, you have an exercise called the core connection breath. The core connection breath teaches you how to contract your transverse abdominis and isolate that muscle. Now, I think a lot of people can jump into integration, which is the next step we'll talk about. But a lot of women jump into integrating their core and trying to contract their core or maybe brace their core during their lifts postpartum. And as a result, this can create a lot of imbalances in our core muscles. I've seen clients who have had overactive obliques. I've seen clients who have had overactive lats or even overactive glutes as a result of a weakness in their transverse abdominis. Because that muscle is so vital for stabilizing our pelvis and stabilizing our spine during our lifts, it's really important that we learn to isolate our transverse abdominis so that we can rebuild its strength to a level that is equal or near equal with the other supporting muscles of our pelvis and our spine. So this is similar to laying a foundation of a home. Now, if you were to build a home, let me ask you, would you rather build a home on a sandy beach or would you rather build a home on a rocky mountain? Of course, you would rather build it on a rocky mountain. Beaches are beautiful, right? But not only are their mountain views great, you'll know that the foundation of that home is going to be so much stronger on the rock than it is on sand. right? And in the same way, we lay a foundation for our movement that is stable and strong when we have a strong transverse abdominis. Super important that we learn how to isolate that muscle and make sure that we're not getting any co-contractions or what I would call an overreaction to a core brace from other supporting core muscles. And we're going to do a fun exercise here together to help you isolate your transverse abdominis. Are you ready? I want you to take a deep breath in. And then you're going to blow that air out like you're blowing out 1,000 candles. So keep blowing all that air out. Keep blowing the air out. Keep blowing the air out. And at the end, as you feel like you can't blow out any more air, I want you to think about pulling your hip bones together. Okay, as you exhaled all of that air out, you should have felt a small contraction or tightening just below your belly button or in between your hip bones. That is your transverse abdominis. If you didn't feel it the first time, it's okay. It probably took me about 3 weeks before I could really contract and relax that muscle. It's okay if you didn't feel it right away. I would encourage you to try that exercise a couple more times so you can feel your transverse abdominis getting isolated. So, once we have assessed our diastasis recti and we've taken notes on where we have a gap and how big the gap is, then we have isolated our transverse abdominis and we now know how to contract and build strength around the linea alba. Next, we're going to learn how to integrate exercise and core bracing. This is the step that most people get so excited about. Maybe it's the step that you're like, finally, why didn't you get to this sooner? Well, we're here, Nervous Nancy, so let's dive into it. Now, if you skipped this step and perhaps maybe just went right back into training like you were doing before pregnancy, I get it. I understand. We can be in a rush to want to feel strong again. Bounce back pressure is real, right? But when we step into a place of knowing how to isolate our core, we've assessed it, now we can approach training strategically, knowing that, yes, we still will be lunging, we still will be squatting, we still will be doing our deadlifts, but we'll be doing those deadlifts with a core that is prepared and on board for it. It's kind of like putting on a bra before you go for a run. Okay, so if you're going out for a run and you don't have a bra on, what's the issue? We're flopping around. Sure, we're still getting our steps in. We're still outside, but what's the issue? We can actually damage a ligament in our breasts called the Cooper's ligament. Fun fact. The reality is having a strong core helps to support our body and build strength in a much faster and more sustainable way. Training over a weak core, like I said earlier, is like trying to drive a car with a flat tire. Yes, you'll still go further, but the reality is that you can cause damage along the way because your body will find ways to compensate without having a core. And that typically is the result of having more of our low back pain that people experience, maybe muscle spasms, or overall just general weakness and fatigue. That's why if we skip this step, we can lead to jumping into higher intensity work before the body is ready for it. So if you're doing jump rope, or if you're doing jump squats, if you're doing box jumps and you're noticing symptoms like urinary incontinence or maybe heaviness, we're going to talk about what are those symptoms at the end here that we need to get help with on our pelvic floor. But if we rush into training without learning how to get our core on board, we're kind of setting ourselves up for a regression years and or months ahead. So that's why it's super important. How do we integrate our core into our training? This is the question. I have an approach that I take with my clients that I start with upper body exercises first. And we do upper body exercises for a couple of weeks, really focusing on our core contraction, like I had given you the cue earlier to pull your hip bones together and blow out the candles. I teach clients how to contract their transverse abdominis in upper body movements first, particularly or specifically starting with upper body pulling in the horizontal plane. So think maybe rows with a TRX or with a cable, or in a bent over position, like bent over rows at the bench, and teaching women how to isolate and integrate their core into upper body exercises first. Once the horizontal upper body exercises, particularly horizontal pulling, has a good core contraction, then we go to overhead pulling and overhead pressing. Overhead, for some reason, I think that it's most likely because our lats are also a spinal and hip stabilizer. Overhead pressing tends to be a little bit more challenging for women, and so I start there second. Once you've integrated your core and you felt like you've been able to contract and keep your core stable with upper body pulling and upper body pressing, in the overhead and in the horizontal position. Then we can go into lower body exercises, starting with double leg exercises first. So think glute bridges. Both feet are on the floor and we learn how to contract our transverse abdominis as we do a glute bridge. From there, you can go into bodyweight squats to a box, so limited range of motion, both feet on the floor, then going to deadlifts, like maybe a kettlebell deadlift or very light barbell deadlift. And then from there, we can go into single leg movements with both feet on the floor. Think split squats with a core brace, or going from a split squat to perhaps a Cossack squat in the lateral plane, or a lateral lunge, starting to get more dynamic. From there, you can go into even more dynamic exercises like a reverse lunge or a step up that are going to be a little bit more challenging because of how dynamic they are, but also how much more stability is required at the core and the pelvic floor. Once you've mastered upper body core contractions and lower body core contractions, both from overhead work to horizontal work and doing single leg work, then, and only then, do we want to integrate it into total body exercises, thinking like a farmer's carry or carrying groceries, because these tend to be some of the biggest challenge when it comes to feeling our core, because there is so much going on globally at the body to stabilize. However, these are tend to be the most bang for your buck exercises. Once people get there, they tend to really start to feel their core contract while they're doing their day-to-day exercises, and starts to see a lot of benefit when it comes to picking up our kids and feeling stronger, carrying the groceries and feeling stronger, and these tasks don't feel as draining because we have that strong core foundation. So there you have it. That is a step-by-step process for how to integrate your core into your training and the process to do that and the order to do that. So hope you pause the episode. You probably want to write that down. If you don't want to have to figure that out for yourself, you're going to want to sign up for True Strength Builder, True Strength Baby Builder, because in True Strength Baby Builder, we walk you through the process of getting stronger for the first year postpartum. And I include all of these exercises plus so many other core exercises to help you rebuild that strength. It's done for you. You get a monthly group coaching call. You can hop on and get support from me Monday through Friday if anything isn't working or something feels off. Who doesn't want that support, right? It sounds amazing. Okay, moving on to step number 4, which is to reassess. Now, it's one thing to assess your core, to get all the numbers, to identify where you're at, to know where your biggest gap is, but it is another thing to reassess after doing some of the work that we've talked about today, and to be able to celebrate that progress. This is the most missing step in many women's rehab process, because they do not reassess. They feel like they're not making progress and they give up altogether, and then their process takes a lot longer because they're on again, off again, on again, off again. So that's why we're going to really focus on setting up every 3 months to reassess our core strength and reassess our diastasis recti. This is not to micromanage. I would really only recommend doing this while you're specifically focusing on your diastasis recti. You don't have to do this every single week. Like I said, once every 3 months tends to be a sufficient amount to where you can see progress each time that you do it, but not feel like you're micromanaging. So what I'd recommend is to go ahead and set a date up in your calendar, maybe a reminder on your phone to reassess your diastasis recti. But if you skip this step, like I said, we don't know that we're making progress. So set up that date on the calendar. And like I said, if you have not downloaded the 3-day Core Restore and have that worksheet to fill out, what are you waiting for? Do that now. It is in the show notes. We're going to end with signs. 4 signs that it is time to bring in the big guns. I've shared a lot of really practical tips with you here today, and I hope that you have just loved the episode, which, by the way, if you did, leave us a review and drop something that you learned in the review, so when somebody else reads it, they can know how much this podcast will help them too. Okay, that would be super helpful. Do that now if you haven't already. Now, let's talk about the signs when it is time to bring in the big guns or get some help. First is a gap that is measured with abdominal bracing that is greater than 3 finger widths, about 4 inches above the belly button, at the belly button, or 4 inches below the belly button. Now, if you're wondering what those 3 finger widths are, you're going to want to check out the 3-day Core Restore, because in there I show you how to measure with your fingers your diastasis recti. So that is if you're noticing a finger gap that is wider than 3 fingers. Second is leaking with lifting in the gym or at home, even if it's just a little. I think a lot of women just poo-poo, pun to be intended. A lot of women poo-poo their leaking and say it's just normal. And while it is very common amongst postpartum women, I would say that it is not normal, and it is a sign that your pelvic floor is asking for help. And if you ignore that, it won't stay little, it will only get worse, and the frequency of it will likely increase. So that is a sign it's time to get some help. Number 3 is a feeling of heaviness in the perineum. Perineum is that space between your vagina and towards your anus. And that space, if we feel heaviness there, it's a sign we want to get some help because the exercises that we're doing aren't necessarily helping. We could have some maybe abnormal bracing or abnormal breathing patterns, or maybe abnormal contraction of your pelvic floor. And that's something that you just need to have somebody come in, maybe do some internal work, like some release, or to have some hands-on work that could be really helpful for you. Now, if it gets worse with prolonged exercise, that's also a sign of that heaviness. So if you're noticing that heaviness and maybe you notice that it's worse after going for a long walk or after doing a lift, that is a sign. Okay, number 4 is no improvement with core and pelvic floor training. Now, if you go through the 3-day core restore, you do the exercises, you've done them for a couple of weeks, you've reset your core, you've learned how to isolate your transverse abdominis, and you're still not noticing any improvement after those 3, maybe 6 or 9 months, and I'd say it's time to get some help. Just getting that one-on-one hands help is really, really valuable. And yes, even me as a pre and postnatal coach and personal training with years of experience knowing how to move my body and having a really good body awareness and body literacy, I still hired a pelvic floor PT in pregnancy and postpartum to help me. So there's no shame in this game. It is very, very valuable. You are totally worthy of asking for help, and there's nothing wrong with it. As a resource, I want to give you the APTA PT locator. Now, this is just a website that you can go to, but in that website, you type in your location and it'll direct you to physical therapists in your area who specialize in helping pelvic floor dysfunction. So check out the show notes for a link to that if you're wondering if it's time for you to get some big gun help. So I hope that this podcast episode was helpful for you. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see you guys next time.